Hello and welcome back to my latest SQL Server Quickie. In the last SQL Server Quickie, I have talked about the recovery model simple. As you have seen last month, this recovery model has a lot of different drawbacks when you deal with transactions that changes data. Therefore, SQL Server also offers you the recovery model full, which is enabled by default for your database. That recovery model relies on regular transaction log backups, which you have to perform regularly. Now let's switch over to the flipchart where I will explain to you the basic idea behind that recovery model. I want to show you now on the flipchart how you can work with the recovery model full, which is the preferred one when you're working with databases where you have transactions that change your data. Again, like in the last month, we have our timeline, and let's assume that we perform this time only full database backups. The nice thing about the recovery model full is now that we can also perform regularly transaction log backups, which wasn't possible in the recovery model simple. So with full, you are able to perform here transaction log backups. And that's the most important thing, because when you have to restore your database in the case of a failure, you take your latest full database backup and then you can store all the individual transaction log backups to bring your database finally online. Of course, you can still lose some data. It depends on how often, how regularly you perform your transaction log backups, because all the transactions since your last transaction log backup are again lost. But normally you perform those transaction log backups more regularly as your full or differential database backups, therefore you are minimizing your data loss. That's the idea about the recovery model full. You want to minimize your possible data loss. Let's switch now over to SQL Server Management Studio, where I will describe that behavior in more detail to you. In this demonstration, I want to show you how you can work with the recovery model full for a database. Let's create a simple database and a table within it. To be able to perform a transaction log backup, you have to perform in the first step an initial full database backup. If you try to perform a transaction log backup without that initial full database backup, SQL Server will return an error message because there is no full database backup in place. So first, let's perform the necessary full database backup. After you have performed that database backup, SQL Server is now able to perform a transaction log backup, as you can see. Now let's insert a record into the table. After the insertion of the row, we perform another transaction log backup. This transaction log backup consists of all the transactions which have occurred since the last transaction log backup. You have a backup of all the transactions that have occurred within your database. If your database crashes now and you have to restore your database from your backups, you haven't lost any transaction because you will restore in the first step your full database backup and then the 2 transaction log backups that were performed. That's the power of the recovery model full. Therefore, I always recommend using that recovery model when you are dealing with changeable data. In this SQL Server Quickie, I have introduced the recovery model full to you. This is the default recovery model that you should always use when you deal with databases which have dynamic changeable data. If you work with that recovery model, it is also very important to perform regular transaction log backups. because otherwise your transaction log will grow and grow and grow over time. I hope that you have enjoyed today's SQL Server Quickie, and I'm already looking forward to seeing you again next month when I will talk about the recovery model bulk locked, the last one that SQL Server supports. Stay tuned!